resource guide really builds on lessons learned from negotiations between Indigenous communities and the extractive industry, and extends them to other sectors such as infrastructure as well as conservation. And we have been investing in this approach because it strengthens our partnerships with communities who are among the most critical allies in conservation, but it also encourages greater transparency and accountability. The negotiations program and guide has really been a collaborative and iterative process with our Indigenous partners across the globe. And we will be hearing from many of them today who have had the experiences of negotiating in their own communities or with supporting communities in negotiation, but they have been key contributors to the development of this program. And why do we really say negotiations, and what do they mean? It's sort of collective and communal. And it's also place-based as opposed to policy-based. And the resource guide is really part of a multifaceted program that includes capacity strengthening workshops with communities, technical advice, and support from skilled partners and negotiators, and general support to communities during their negotiations. And really, I think it's important, our vision is that this work will facilitate new precedent-setting agreements between communities and project proponents that support Indigenous and local community rights and address priorities and visions for the future. It will ensure that they can continue to steward their nature, which is what they rely on. So again, this is a collective process. It's learning across communities, across organizations. It's having critical conversations. And I now want to pass it to Patty Dunn, who will give a brief overview of the Indigenous Negotiations Guide and Program.
Great, thank you, Kristen. I am just sharing my screen, so hopefully you will see PowerPoint. So thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Patty Dunn. I'm the programmatic lead on the CI's Indigenous Negotiations Program, and I'm really excited to be here to share this resource and also to talk a little bit more about the program. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes just to explain the resource guide and where you can find it before we hear from our panelists. So the Indigenous Negotiations Resource Guide has been a work in progress for a couple of years now. And as Kristen mentioned, it's benefited quite a bit from the feedback and input and insights of our Indigenous partners, as well as our partners at Oxfam and Rainforest Foundation US. And it builds on the lessons that have been learned in negotiations between extractive industry and Aboriginal Australian communities, as well as Canadian First Nation communities. And we're very much indebted to the work of Kieran O'Farkley from Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia, as well as Ginger Gibson from the Firelight Group, who we're going to be hearing from in just a few minutes. The negotiations guide itself is geared towards community negotiators, so individuals who are going to be representing their communities at the negotiations table. So there's quite a lot of information in here that's also very helpful for the community as a whole. And it's divided into three main sections. So the first section is the preparation for the negotiation. So it talks about understanding human rights. It talks about some of the considerations that communities might need to take into account when they're deciding whether or not negotiations is the right approach for them, as well as some of the steps that they can take to be better prepared for the negotiation. The second section is on the negotiation itself. So it talks about some of the tactics and strategies that communities can use, as well as some components of what makes a good agreement. And then finally, the final section is on implementation. And so this really focuses on monitoring and enforcement of a signed agreement, as well as considerations for when it might be appropriate to go back to the negotiation table to revisit aspects of a signed agreement. And this is applicable to many sectors. So it can work. It's relevant for mining as well as infrastructure projects, and certainly conservation projects as well. And this resource guide is part of a larger program that we've been working on since 2017. And again, the development of this program, just as the development of the guide, has been very much informed by the insights and feedback from our partners. And the goal of this program is to support communities so that they have the resources that they need to be able to negotiate good agreements that uphold their rights and address their priorities and ensure their continued stewardship of their territories. And part of that is respecting the right of communities to say no to a project, and also recognizing that negotiations are one approach. They are not the only approach, and it's ultimately up to the community to decide what's best for them. The negotiations program, like the guide, is made up of three main components. The first are our community trainers, and these are individuals that work with communities and hold capacity building programs with communities to strengthen the negotiation skills that communities already have. And they also serve as critical resources for translating the materials to the local context, as well as to the local language in some cases. This next bucket of work is that our component is our Pungor advisors. Pungor is a Kalinga term from the Philippines, and it means peace pact holder. And so in Kalinga culture, the chief has the authority to wage war, but the Pungor has the authority to make and enforce peace agreements. And so our Pungor advisors are a group of individuals that have extensive experience negotiating for their own communities, as well as supporting other communities in negotiations. And they're able to provide an additional level of technical support and advice to communities in a negotiation. And then the final component is financial support. And so I think, as we all probably know, negotiations can be short, they can be a few weeks, but they also can be years and sometimes decades. And they're not cheap. So one of the other pieces that we're working on is providing financial support to communities so that they're able to meet the financial costs of a negotiation and sustain that negotiation if needed in the long term. And then undercutting all of this are our knowledge exchanges, which are moments when we all get to come together and share share our experiences and lessons, and also develop new strategies for moving forward. And we're currently, CI is currently piloting this work in Guyana and in the Philippines, and we're hoping to advance the work to other places. I'm just going to show you very quickly where you can find the negotiations resource guide if you're interested in taking a look at the guide itself. It is available on CI's website, and hopefully you can see the web page here. Ali is also dropping the link in the chat. And on this particular web page, you'll see a little bit of information about the program and the guide itself, as well as a link to where you can download the resource guide as a PDF. And we welcome sharing of this resource guide to anyone that you think would benefit from it. We also have some information on where you can get in touch with me or with Ali Cruz, who also works on this in this program. And we're happy to answer any questions or talk more about the program if anything arises after this webinar. And then finally, we have a series of case studies. These are all from East and Southern Africa. So they cover negotiations in Kenya, Tanzania, Botswana, and South Africa. And these were written by our first cohort of Pungor advisors. And they're really rich resources for learning about different strategies and tactics that have been used in other places. And we'll be adding to this as additional case studies are written. So please stay tuned. I'm going to pause there and hand it back over to Kristen.
Great. Thanks, Patty. And thanks for sharing that resource. And again, I think, the reason why we have been looking at this type of resource is really to respond to what we see as an organization, but also the threats that we see to the communities that we work with. We want to transition now from the guide to the actual experience and hear from partners and community members as to why negotiations are important for communities. And I have the great pleasure of introducing Sine, and he is a really dynamic and inspiring community and committed leader and educator. And he was born in Pandolan in the Wild Coast, a place with deep significance in his life, and this is part of his life, working with communities around the Wild Coast to negotiate and to combat mining that is impacting his territory. So Sine, I will pass it to you to really talk about the importance of negotiations, and you'll have about 10 minutes, okay, Sine?
Okay, thank you.
Welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christine. I hope I'm audible enough and people could hear me on the other side. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come in and to share my thoughts on this. But first and foremost, I think it is appropriate to pass the word of gratitude to CI for having taken the time and resources, excuse me, and the effort to put together this particular negotiation tool. I believe it is something that would be very useful to any in indigenous communities anywhere in the world. And I think that the tool, more than anything, is about helping indigenous people when they are facing the extractive industry or the multinational corporations that come to their area. We must remember that these multinational corporations, more than often, they come to the lands of indigenous people uninvited. And as much as there are laws out there that protect indigenous people and their territories, but the reality is that more than often, politicians or the public office bearers in various countries, they tend to partner with these multinational corporations that come. In particular, the most common, of course, is the extractive industry. And we know that also increasingly since 2019, every year we have more than 200 indigenous people's leaders being murdered and assassinated for standing up to protect their rights. So it is a tool that is coming at a very critical time when the global community is facing climate change, where the multinational corporations, for instance, in our area, we have just been fighting since November last year. Shell, the very Shell, the oil giant, has come to our waters, and we're involved in that particular struggle where we are saying no to exploration for oil and gas when the world is supposed to be cutting down. So these tools become very, because these multinational corporations, they are greedy for profits and they go all over the world. And indigenous people's territories are always seen as a soft target because justifications such as saying people are poor, they need jobs and all that are used. And it is very important that indigenous people are able to make sure that their voice is heard. And this tool is about ensuring that the voice of the indigenous people in their territories, in their land, could be organized and be packaged. And the case studies are actually sharing the strategies that have been used by various communities, indigenous people all over the world. So it is a tool that is adding to the toolbox that indigenous people have, because it's not like we are saying indigenous people do not have the tools that they use when they are faced with these challenges. But it is for the first time that indigenous people at their disposal have got an organized toolbox that has got a set of strategies that could actually be used. More than often as indigenous people, we always have to look at the challenge that we are facing and look within our toolboxes and see what to use. It is for the first time that we have a common tool that is being handed to us, that is available to us to use and to be able to look and learn from other indigenous people, local communities all over the world, and see how they have. And I think it's a very dynamic tool that people take it and adapt it to their conditions, and to be able to say, what lessons can they learn? How can they further package, and how can they use it to make sure that their voice or their voices and the voices of the elders, of the leaders, of the indigenous people, of the ordinary people within that particular area is heard? As I'm saying, more than often, when these challenges come to our areas, the voices that are normally heard, the journalists, they will go and interview those multinational corporations, they will talk to the politician, but no one really takes time to hear. And these strategies, therefore, about what can we do to make sure that our voices as local people, as indigenous people, are really heard, and they are packaged in a manner that is going to create an impact. So thank you very much for the tool. And I wish the indigenous people all over the world all the best as they look through this, and as they translate it to their languages, and they begin to explore and to look at the options that are available. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and in particular for the tool. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sina, and I think you've really set the stage to continue the conversation. So we're gonna now travel to Asia and to the Philippines, and we're gonna hear from Jo Ann Guillao, who is a Kanake Kalunga Ibola from Benguet in the Philippines. And she is a research enthusiast and has various orientations on Indigenous people's rights, climate change, human rights, Indigenous women, and organizational development, a strong background in facilitation and developing training and design for communities. And so we welcome Jo Ann. Can we bring her to the spotlight, Ali, so that she can share with us her experience? Can we switch the spotlight, Ali? Yes. There we go. Thanks, Jo Ann, and thanks for joining us in your evening. I will turn the floor over to you, and I know you have some other materials to share with us as well. Go ahead, Jo Ann.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for allowing us to be able to share in this discussion. Good evening from the Philippines. To start off the discussion, I would like to ask Patty to share us a short video. This is will inspire further reflections and some views as we continue with this discussion. Thanks.
All right, so Archie will let you know when we can meet, but let's keep going.
No.
Yep.
No, sir. No, sir.
Yep, let's keep going.
No, no. That's not right.
Got a road to build. We've got as much right to be here as you have.
No, no, that's not right, sir.
Yeah, it is.
We have already our complaint to our barangay captain. And we are... Our complaint was already submitted to our barangay captain, and we have read it already. Then we can meet on the neutral ground to the office of the barangay captain. That will do.
Okay.
Thank you.
But we still keep going.
No, you cannot.
Yeah.
No.
No.
Please don't do it.
We have as much right to be here as you have.
Our right before and right now is still alive. Yeah, because we are still alive. Yeah. Arrived how long years? But for us, we've been here for a long time. All the mining company before, they have that respect coming from us and from them. Both respect was being brought up.
I've agreed to talk, but we can also keep going.
No, sir, we cannot.
Yep.
No.
Why not?
Because there's nothing yet written agreement.
We don't need one. The government's told us we don't need an agreement. We can keep going.
We didn't sold it to you.
Let's go.
No, sir. Don't do this to us, please.
Nipipilit ay mura.
This is not right.
It's not wrong either.
You are wrong. Because you didn't acquire our land.
It's not your
We have
land.
our complaint to our barangay captain, and we are requesting on that you should respect also our complaint.
We'll listen to your complaint, but it's not your land. It's government land.
It is our land.
Government land.
It is our land.
Thank you, Patty. I think we can stop there. So again, this is Jo Ann Guillao, akan kanay Igorot from Benguet. In the Cordillera region, we will find indigenous peoples collectively called as Igorots, whose population is close to 2 million based on 2015 census. Our Igorot communities are strongly attached to our ili, or home, or the land of one's birth. This is considered to be our source of identity, belongingness, and life direction. The ili, or community, provides a sense of perpetual belonging. It plays a critical role in shaping our beliefs, values, and views about the world as an individual and as a member of an indigenous group. It is the source of the stories of our ancestors, legends of our origin, and the biodiversity that provides for our daily existence. It bears the land that feeds us. Our very own land is an attraction to other people because it bears so many resources and potential for development and well-being. Participation in decision-making is very, very relevant to us indigenous peoples and local communities, and negotiated agreements play a critical role in setting conditions under which resource development occurs on indigenous land. The land is a fundamental asset for sustainable economic development for indigenous peoples, and our land rights are critical for self-determination. Dialogue and negotiation are some of the bedrock of democratic civilization. These are preceded by mutual respect, and without which there could have been no means for each of us, or one of us, from the individual to the state level, to communicate and develop mutually beneficial social contracts. Moreover, also emphasized in the short video is the equally significant role of neutral parties that serve as arbitrators to two opposing factions. Again, the short documentation is showing us realities in the ground that indeed there are existing gaps and inequality in terms of decision-making and participation. We need an equalizer to lessen this gap and avoid further harm to communities. Negotiations between private companies or governments and indigenous peoples often involve complicated issues, including how to address identity and fundamental value differences, as well as resource allocation. Companies, governments, and other institutions must understand that the value of land to IPLCs is fundamental because of its spiritual significance, the exercise of self-determination, and the value of identity. I would say the success of negotiation is not to please the company or government, but to uphold the rights of those marginalized. Hence, to maximize the potential of negotiation, respect must emanate from the start. Respect for FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. Respect for the rights of indigenous communities, and respect for the rule of law, including that of indigenous processes to arrive at shared solutions for any outstanding issues that will impact the communities, including the presence of extractive industries, as previously mentioned also by our first speaker. We welcome these indigenous resource guides, and we look forward to having these materials be localized and translated. As you can see, this event just happened recently, and we are very much still positive that given all these tool guides that we can access, it can really help us leverage to address issues and concerns of communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo Ann, and thank you for sharing that case that happened so recently, because I think it really puts people in the moment and the struggles that communities have and what the imminent threats are on a daily basis. I think the points that you made regarding negotiations as a way to uphold Indigenous rights and move that forward is an important factor. I want to turn now, we're going to shift again to, we've gone from Africa through Asia, and I want to shift to Anne-Marie Sam, who is from the next Adzali Wuten, an Indigenous community in the northern British Columbia of what is known as Canada. She will tell us the story of how it took many years to build a relationship, to come into a relationship with a resource company in Canada. So Anne-Marie, hopefully we were able to get your microphone working, and we'll shift.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay, that's great. Bendata Hunzu, good morning from British Columbia. I'm joining you from the Lekwungen speaking territory of the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nation. I'm very honored that I was invited to speak and about the importance of negotiations for communities and the importance of this document that has been completed. I'm trying to think of, there's so many stories that come to mind. I'll tell you a little bit of the background of my background as I just remembered to start my clock so that I keep on time. I come from, born into the Lasiliu Frog clan. We were born into a responsibility to take care of the water. But also been adopted into my father's clan, the Amasiu, it's the Beaver clan, and their responsibility as warriors to protect the community. So I'm always reminded that I was born with this responsibility to fight for protection of water and land, and so that Indigenous communities can continue to be connected, to continue to be connected to healthy lands and healthy waters, and be healthy themselves. In our area, we've had years of lots of logging happening, so deforestation in our area, that and some of our members have taken part in that industry. But an example of how much it has increased in the last few years is from in the 10 years from 2017 to 2007, we had more logging and deforestation than the previous 60 years. And so it's happening at a faster scale, but also it means that other industries then have access to our territories because it's easier for mining companies to come in or exploration companies to come in. And I share that information because so many times we hear that the community should leave it to the experts, that the companies know what's best, governments know what's best, and communities are not seen as the experts. They're seen as a hurdle that we need to get around. And my experience has been to just never give up as a community, always state how important the land is, always be willing to voice your concerns about the impacts that a project is going to have on your community, because most of the time we were hearing the focus being on the jobs and opportunities for community members. Oh, you know, you're poor, and if you take part in this industry, you'll become rich just like us. And it never seems to happen. The jobs don't come to our people. People from other places come into our territory and impact us. And the one thing I really wanted to highlight about the importance of negotiating and for all parts of the community to be part of the negotiations. So women, especially the young men, the young women, youth, and the elders, all to be part of the negotiation, because it's not just about jobs and opportunities. It's about keeping that connection to our territories that for generations our ancestors took care of, and we still trying to uphold that responsibility. And in our community, and the example that I wanted to share was just the importance of even though there are some in the community or surrounding area that are supportive of an industry, just finding this, I find the more we talk about the importance of negotiations and the people who are at the table, the better it is to show why negotiations are so important. And for us, the big learning was in all the research around natural resource extraction was the definite examples of impact to community, and especially impact to women. So in our territory, we were starting to see an increase in sexual assaults and violence, and when we brought it to the authorities and to government, they said, well, that's not what our data shows. And so they weren't concerned about it. But we wanted to protect our community, and also we had to, it's a tough discussion to talk about violence against women and violence in community. And it was increasing, and we were seeing the impacts that were happening in our community, and we couldn't just sit back and let the negotiations for our project go on without addressing. So we had for years logging camps in our area that impacted our women, and then we had a mine camp that was developed in our area of I think there was at one point 1,000 people working in that camp. And then we had proposed pipeline development and camps that were moving throughout our territory. And I always remember the one meeting that we went to where our chiefs were sitting around getting ready for a meeting with government. And they were talking about what the focus they wanted this meeting to be on. And I was sitting in the back listening, and just having to find that courage to put my hand up and to say to our leaders who will be talking about the importance of protecting our women and how do we prevent violence against women, because what the company has brought to us is a proposal for a rape crisis line that people could call when something happens. And for me, that is not enough, that we are just expecting this to happen to our community members. And we need to do better. And so maybe Ginger will touch on the work that we did in Northern BC to advocate for change. Our negotiations went from negotiating in the community and pushing the company on what needs to change and the importance of protecting our community, but also that went into advocating for change at the provincial government level, at the federal level, that no longer is it only acceptable that you do environmental impacts, that you need to do human health impacts also. So I will leave it at that, and just thank you for this opportunity to share this morning.
Thank you, Anne Marie, and thank you for sharing. I think, the issues that you've raised is the communities as experts, the importance of land and the impacts of land when others come into it, the issues of voice and making sure that all voices are heard, And I think, the issues that you have raised related to gender-based violence, which are not always surfaced to the ground when these types of impacts happen in the community, but also the transformation that has happened. And as the negotiations began with the community, how that has transformed at multiple scales within the context of Canada on these issues. So thank you so much for sharing and raising these issues. I'm going to transition now to Emily Greenspan, another one of our partners from Oxfam. She's Associate Director of Oxfam America, Extractive Industries Global Program based in Washington. And she has been working on extractive industries issues for more than 15 years with a particular focus on land and community rights. So Emily, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks very much. And thank you to CI for the opportunity to speak with this group today at the launch of this excellent new resource guide. I remember when Oxfam, CI, and Rainforest Foundation colleagues sat down to discuss the need for a guide like this in the before COVID days. And we had the opportunity to actually gather some of our Indigenous partners across a range of programs together and really sort of sit in a room together and nut through some of what we really thought would be beneficial from such a tool. So it's so exciting to see now the final product launched, the wealth of information incorporated into this guide. As mentioned, I work with Oxfam America, and for those of you not familiar, Oxfam America's Extractive Industries Program works on oil, gas, and mining issues in around 30 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We partner with civil society to promote good governance and demand accountability around extractive industry investments. And unfortunately, throughout the 20-year life of our program, very often we're seeing that economic benefits of these projects are accruing to companies and national governments, and while communities are bearing the brunt of the impacts and without getting their fair share of the wealth. Communities often don't have a seat at the table when major decisions are being made about projects that affect their lands, and community consultations are often falling far short of best practice. So I thought I'd just share three cases that Oxfam has been working on in recent years, which demonstrate the range that we're seeing in terms of how governments and companies are consulting and negotiating with communities. And the first case really falls short of any of the best practices highlighted in CI's new guide, and that's the case in Guatemala. In December, the Guatemalan government finalized a prior consultation process with indigenous communities around the Phoenix nickel mine in El Estor near Lake Isabel. The mine is extremely controversial, has a problematic history of decades of human rights abuses. There's considerable opposition to the mine among the local Maya Kichi communities. And in fact, the court suspended the mine in 2019 due to lack of compliance with the International Labor Organization Convention 169. Unfortunately, the government implemented the community consultation process late last year during a period in which it simultaneously declared a state of siege, suspending some basic human rights in the area. And in addition, community members that participated in the consultation did not include all interested and relevant leaders. As I'm sure many of you participating in this call will know and may have experienced directly, often these processes can turn into empty rubber stamping exercises where communities are forced to accept predetermined results. Interestingly, there's been a very recent development in the case of the Phoenix mine. The Constitutional Court has just determined that December consultation process fell short of legal requirements. In Guatemala, this can mean potentially halting the mining project and reopening the consultation. It's happened on more than one occasion in the country. So it will be really interesting to watch this space. But it's another reminder of how these really rushed and inadequate processes end up hurting all parties, because the government and companies don't really benefit from this short-sighted approach to negotiation either. In another case I'd like to talk about is in Kenya. We have produced some research in a couple of years back, which looks at oil exploration underway on pastoralist lands in the north of the country. And it highlighted some really significant gaps in terms of the negotiations processes with local communities. We found that communities had very limited knowledge of the contents of their agreements that the leaders were signing with Tullow Oil. And they had limited opportunity to confer and build a common approach amongst themselves prior to the signature of the agreements, which is so important, as outlined really helpfully in CI's resource guide. The company had promoted the establishment of well pad committees, which were made up of community members, which I think is a sort of innovative approach. The idea was to monitor the use of revenues allocated through these benefit sharing agreements. But unfortunately, we found that in practice, these tended to be dominated by influential men in the community with limited participation of women. And overall, while we found that Tello had implemented some activities aiming to ensure more community participation, and had tried to promote a higher degree of accountability with regard to the benefit sharing agreements, they fell really far short of the best practice outlined in the resource guide, and many gaps remained. So I will be happy to share a link to this research, testing community consent, in the chat, and I would encourage folks to have a look if you're interested in more background on that case. And then the last case I'll mention, just to end on a more positive note, is that we have seen some encouraging results from negotiations in Peru around oil block 192, which is located in the northern Peruvian Amazon. The project is in a very remote part of the Amazon and has resulted in serious health and environmental impacts for over more than 4 decades. They've had close to 200 oil spills just in block 192 alone over a 20-year period. And when the latest contract between the government and company expired, it was a time for a new one to be signed, and Indigenous federations seized on that opportunity to negotiate better contract terms and to demand new community agreements. Ultimately, these lengthy negotiations between Indigenous communities and the government resulted in key modifications to the oil block contract to promote sustainability and protection of Indigenous rights. And this is the first time that's happened in Peru, as far as I'm aware. And the government also signed 67 agreements with Indigenous federations. And these agreements resulted in things like the creation of a participation committee, a social fund for communities in the block, and other commitments related to issues like community environmental monitors and pipeline repair, among others. And I would flag, not to just go too far down the road to optimism, that this progress did not come without a cost. So Indigenous peoples in Block 192 fought for years to have a real say in project decisions and to demand accountability from the government and company for the environmental and health impacts associated with the project. Communities organized among federations across river basins, they protested, they diligently documented health and environmental impacts over many years, and they implemented really interesting creative campaigns. At one point, they even partnered with popular heavy metal bands to call public attention to the severe health impacts of heavy metals in their water as a result of oil pollution. So roughly translated, they had a campaign that said, heavy metal is great, heavy metals aren't. And they had that heavy metal bands promoting this really widely on social media. The strategic use of nonviolent direct action and coalition building among communities and with allies really contributed to their success. Adequate access to independent technical and legal support also helped enable them to negotiate on more equal footing with the government. This case provides a really interesting example, I think, of how communities have been able to creatively leverage power and use negotiations to demand accountability of government. And we also have new research that my colleague Scott Selwood pulled together from the really interesting and in-depth research that local partners have done on the issue of consultation and free prior informed consent, and this case in particular in Peru. So I'll share that link. It's a piece called Negotiating Consent. So stepping back from the specific cases, I appreciate this resource guide as a wonderful tool to help communities as they assess their own readiness and strategic approach to negotiation, all the way from the very beginning of deciding whether to negotiate or not, through to monitoring agreements in the end, which is also crucially important. It provides communities with a wealth of comparative data to inform their decisions. As the policy requirements around Indigenous rights continue to evolve, global policy requirements, and it's been really encouraging for me to see more global recognition of Indigenous people's right to free, prior, informed consent. I'm sure most of the audience is quite familiar with the term FPIC, but I will share the Oxfam definition: the principle that Indigenous peoples and local communities must be adequately informed about projects that affect their lands in a timely manner, free of coercion and manipulation, and should be given the opportunity to approve or reject a project prior to the commencement of the activities. And we really see this as a fundamental tool for Indigenous peoples as they claim their right to self-determination. I've had the opportunity to engage in policy conversations around FPIC for about 15 years, and it's been quite exciting to see the gradual uptake from international financial institutions, companies, industry associations, and to some degree, governments. However, as we all know, the devil's in the details in terms of how these policy commitments will be implemented. And I think CI's new resource guide provides communities with a useful tool to push for meaningful negotiations as policies start to play out in practice. So thanks very much again to CI for this great tool and the opportunity to engage in the conversation. And I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you for sharing the case studies and sort of giving us, building on our previous speakers, but giving us a little bit of the challenges and some of the triumphs, but also some of the changes that are happening. It's still in a very transformative stage. So I want to close this segment, but I'll invite Dr. Ginger Gibson, to the director of the Firelight Group, to be our discussant. She works predominantly on negotiations and implementation of impact and benefit agreements. And she is the co-author of the Impact and Benefit Agreements Community Toolkit for Negotiations. So I welcome her to our scenario here to share her reflections on what our speakers have said and her own experience as well.
Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for your new resource. I'm delighted to see this out here. This kind of resource is so vital for communities to be able to share experiences. Companies often have quite a lot more information than communities do, and so oftentimes we only are able to share what is going on in the resource sector across communities by sharing these types of resources. So I'm going to be happily surprised to see how far this tool makes its way into and around the world. So congratulations to CI on the launch of this tool. I wanted to just offer a couple of thoughts. First of all, negotiations with resource companies are often, negotiations is often it's often the only leverage that communities have to control and manage a project. It doesn't always, a negotiated agreement does not always represent free prior informed consent. We see that constantly in Canada, where nations are pushed into the reality of having to accept a deal that does not represent the free or prior or informed consent. So we have a long ways to go in Canada on ensuring that impact and benefit agreements or agreement making actually is something that represents FPIC. Jo Ann's case really showed us why that is the case. I think we saw there that really moving video. We saw how a government can be permissive and trample the rights of Indigenous peoples who are the traditional owners of an area. And so that's really, it's the fundamental starting point, right? What is the legislation? What is the policy? And what are the drivers there? Happily, Emily just spoke to us about how governments are in some jurisdictions really addressing FPIC in their legislation. In Canada, we have legislation at the federal level, and in British Columbia, we have legislation at the provincial level. Even with legislation, we have a long way to go because companies variously interpret the direction that's given to them by government, and they variously, as Emily just signaled, they variously interpret what it means. So some companies, you'll look at their policies, and that's one wonderful tool, is to look at the policy that a company has on Indigenous people, read it closely, and use it at the table to really hold them to their words. But often their words are slippery, and so we see some companies committing to free prior informed consent, but only in new projects. And so it's very important to look at the policies that are out there from both the government, the legislation from the government at hand, and then the policies of the companies. One of our great tools in negotiations is our own policies. So the policies that communities issue or the declarations that communities issue. So I'm going to signal a couple of areas where I see the potential for hope and opportunity for hope in negotiations. So first of all, the tools and support. So this CI tool is a negotiation resource guide, which will unlock the opportunities that exist across the globe. And when you look through tools like this, you can find the small spaces and the small wins that you can champion yourself. So in them, you can find the stories of a community or a company that have been respectful of free, prior, informed consent, or have won an agreement that is hopeful, that provides examples and opportunities for communities to move forward. Secondly, this sorts of tools this sort of tool that you see here, the Negotiations Resource Guide, it also offers the opportunity to look at policies communities have issued and can issue. Canadian Indigenous communities in Canada, Indigenous nations in Canada, have been launching their own policies requiring FPIC themselves for decades now. And so even where the government is not permissive, even where the company has a policy that is not permissive, a community can issue its expectations for consent, what that looks like, and they can issue that themselves. Second area of hope in negotiations is community to community support. So even where a company is not respectful or is slow to the mark, communities can support each other. So I often look, when I'm in negotiations, I often look for the communities that have already contracted or settled a relationship with the company to learn about what they've managed to do. And so I think that across the globe, you see Canadian Indigenous communities supporting Peruvian Indigenous communities to get the same access to rights that Canadian communities do. If it's the same company, surely they should behave towards Indigenous people in Peru as they behave in Canada, and vice versa. Thirdly, Anne really signaled an important issue, which is the addressing gender-based violence. Negotiations have the opportunity. We heard that oftentimes the negotiations are a space controlled by men. We see that changing. I just completed an agreement with women on all sides, and that was really exciting. So women that were negotiating from the company, all women, and then from the nation, all women. And boy, did we address different things. And so I think you do see the opportunity when you change up your negotiation team. I think you do see the opportunity to address different issues. That agreement really does strikingly address gender-based violence. It's set in play of a 6-person team who are known as Team Goose. And the Team Goose is a little bird. It's a carrier term from Northern BC, the little bird that knows everybody's business. And so that little bird actually addresses issues before they become a sexual assault. So when that little bird hears about flying around the territory, hears about sexual luring or contractors or construction camp workers attempting to procure sexual services or to sell drugs to kids or being near the high schools, that little bird flies in and addresses the issue. So I do see negotiations really being able to now turn and address the kinds of gender-based violence concerns that we've seen across the resource sector. The reality is, though, Anne was signaling that there's some work in BC around construction camps in particular. Anne was a real champion in British Columbia for a project that really tried to leverage solutions and tried to negotiate and bring forward the world of solutions around gender-based violence in the resource sector and the accountabilities that legislators, that governments, that industry, and that communities can hold. So I'll just close by saying negotiations can occur between communities to resource companies, but they can also occur between communities and governments. And in some ways, the community to government angle is the more important one, both in the legislation that we request and require, but also in the permissive approach that governments take. They're the first actor to let rights, to release rights and relinquish rights in some cases. And so that negotiation is one that is profoundly important and often precedes what we're doing with resource companies. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this session today. It was very exciting to be with all of you and travel across the globe to hear about all of your stories. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Ginger. And I think you made some really important points about community negotiations with respect to communities and governments and the importance of understanding the government legislation, the company's policies, but also communities' own policies in that effort. And I think you reflected on a lot of what our panelists have said as well. I would like to bring back all of our panelists to the spotlight, Ali, and then have a bit of time for discussion amongst everyone else. If you could spotlight everyone just so we can see them all on the screen, that would be great. I know you might need a minute to do that. In the meantime, I want to kick off the discussion for any of our speakers today. What do you see as some of the key factors that communities should weigh in when considering whether or not to negotiate a project component? Any thoughts from any of our speakers? I think we have two of us.
If I may come in, I think when we talk about negotiations, it is more than sitting on a table and talk to the company. It's about voicing your own views, making sure that your feelings, your views about how you feel about, I can say, an invasion of your land, or about that mining company that come. So this the term negotiation here, it doesn't only speak to sitting around a table with those but it's about making sure that your voices and your rights are being honored, and you are able to voice how you feel. In other words, you will see when one looks through those case studies, looking through the tool, that the most important thing is to make sure that people on their land, they are able to have a voice, whether the voice is about saying no, and you don't, and sitting around the table is one option. But even looking at media, looking at litigation, having lawyers, so there's a whole lot of strategies that do. And I think in rounding off is to say, it's always wise to have a variety of strategies in your negotiation. You don't only use one, or you don't only open one door, but you bring together a combination of factors. And it's also very important that it's not only a lone voice of the negotiator on the table, but many voices going to the elders who are sitting at home, who might not even be able to go to meetings, and like having films that go around interviewing those people, adding their voice in terms of how they feel about their land and their space, and that is being invaded. Thank you.
Thank you, Sine. Would anyone else like to contribute to this question?
Yes. Yeah, I just want to add some more. Yeah, I think we are learning, relearning, and unlearning from good and bad experiences. This reminds me of our elders who have this process in the community we call tungtungan in our indigenous language, where we value the presence of dialogues amongst us, especially among our elders, because this is where we create spaces for consensus building, I think, and this is very important for indigenous peoples and local communities, where we have these spaces that we can really voice out our perspectives, as CD has started to share, and this will also allow us to really look into details on which issues to compromise, because these are some realities. There are some compromises that will take place, and we really need to have that enough time, enough resources to be able to do that consensus building amongst us indigenous peoples. And just to add more, I think one of those areas that we really need much is set of arrangement or enabling conditions where we can really air our grievances and to be able to redress whatever wrongs were done for the community. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that the point of learning and relearning, and also engaging with elders, but the importance of enabling conditions in this process. Anyone else like to contribute to this question?
Maybe if I could just jump in with one example, I think that's so important, that piece about the time necessary and the information. And We had an interesting case in Bolivia at one point a few years back when an oil company had come in, and it was actually the Ministry of Hydrocarbons at the time that came in and said, okay, we're going to do this consultation. The process is going to move forward. This is the timeline. This is the information. And I found it really compelling that actually the community pushed back. It was a community that was familiar with drilling, and they knew some of the risks, and they said, no, actually, we need more time. We want the dates to be this. And they changed the calendar. They said, we need more information. We want you actually to come to the field so that we can show you in person some of the issues we're concerned about. And they also really demanded more attention towards the community monitoring, and they had already built up their skills in community monitoring. And I think that that was really fundamental to them being able to reach agreements at the end of the day, because they changed the terms and the government, to their credit, responded and met those demands. And then they both went in with a more clear understanding of what they wanted to get out of it. And that, I think, really contributed to them reaching final agreements that actually lasted for quite a long time.
Thank you. And I think the pushback from communities to change the power dynamics on those elements. Anyone else?
I'll just add one thing, which is that the importance of preparation, the importance of getting to know a project before anyone is in the position where they feel they need to give consent. And so I've seen communities take a long time before they don't give consent, and a long time before they do give consent. Getting to know it through environmental assessment, getting to know it through solid planning, getting to know it by asking questions, getting to know it by traveling on the land. So it's so important to get to know the project and really grapple with it and understand it before anyone gives a free, prior, informed consent. The pressure that can emerge is very intense. And so I'll just comment that that's a tough reality.
Thanks. So maybe just building on that question, and I do invite people to put their questions in the chat as we're going along this. Just building on what Ginger had said, is how can NGOs and other project proponents be better negotiating partners with communities? We know that conservation, while it should be a very aligned ally, is not always the best ally of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So what are the factors that would contribute to NGOs and other project proponents being better negotiating partners or better supporters in this process? Anyone like to tackle that question?
Sure, I'll just say the importance of listening. You know, it really is so important to just listen. And not assume that you have a mandate to speak for. Just listen and support. You know, you have NGOs and conservation organizations can have very powerful access to information. They can organize, they can connect communities, they can research, but they need to listen and not overstep.
Okay, Patty, any thoughts about how we can better support in negotiations?
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of technology issues. I think Ginger really hit the nail on the head in the sense of, listening, but also I think in terms of really thinking about how we share information about potential projects in the planning phase as well as the implementation phase, and try to make sure that we are transparent and that there are accountability mechanisms in place, for ourselves, just to make sure that we are living up to our end of the agreement. So really making sure information is available, that it's transparent, that it's shared in a culturally appropriate way, and that communities know where to access it.
Emily, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to jump back to Ginger's previous point, actually, about just how long the process could take. And I think that's one thing that I'm trying to make sure I keep in mind. Our Block 192, I mean, we've been working on that project for over a decade already. And so it can be really, I think it's just recognizing up front that you need to make the investment and consider the sustainability and be in it for the long term, because these processes can take quite a while.
Sine, I see you popped up on our screen.
Yes, I think also the point just that have been made about listening. I think it's very important that when the NGOs come into space, that they do not take over from the Indigenous people. Whatever support that they give, but it has got to be support where the Indigenous people, the local people, they continue to lead that particular process. So the support should be enabling those people to speak for themselves instead of the NGOs speaking on their behalf. NGOs, they are well connected, they will source the information, but at the end of it all, they have to make sure that if they have got better information, they build the capacity of those people. The struggle of the people must be led by the people themselves. So that is a very, very important, and I cannot overemphasize enough the point that she made about making sure that they listen, and listening is about learning and hearing those voices so that whatever is taken to the negotiation table, and my addition is that the indigenous people have got always to be at the forefront of their struggle to protect their land so that they are able to chant and to show the young ones how it's done. So it's very, very important. Support is very critical, but always keep those local people. They must never be absent on the negotiation table. Thank you.
Sine, before you hop off camera, I wanted to maybe push you just a little bit further about the elements of negotiations, because I do know that your community did decide that negotiations weren't right for them and decided to say no to a project. Could you share a little bit about that? Because I think this relates highly with what you were talking about just now.
Yes. Okay. Yes, we have said no for 2 decades now, and of course, the mining companies they will never give up because they have the government backup because they are seen as investors. So, but it is important to, like I said, and also a point that's made within the toolbox, it says the preparations and making sure that you are ready, you are united, you have got one particular common vision. So that's very important, so that whoever was on the negotiation table knows that it's representing the voices of the people. So, but also it's very important that your negotiations or your struggle to say no is done at all levels. In other words, at the community level, people must be able to participate fully and own that particular struggle, and their voices there. But also you go to courts of law where the government and the mining company is not listening. So we have been able to do that. We've got litigation, we bring in media, and we continuously engage media. We do updates. We also do our own media statements. So whenever an incident happens, we make sure that we write a statement that goes to the media in order to make sure that the voice of the people is always out there. So we have got a list of the media houses of journalists. So we make sure that we say something. When the journalists come, we have to take them from village to village where they are able to interview people and hear what people are saying. So that it's not only the voice of the spokesperson, there's the voices of those who are leaders, but it's also the ordinary people. But also in courts of law to make sure that the constitution of the country, the laws, they are taken care of. So hence, I'm saying there must be different layers, because if you are fighting in one front, it means if you get defeated in that particular front, then your voice is the end of it. Whilst if you are doing it at different levels, and also you allow people to participate in order to support those at the negotiation table, it is something, so you are able to sustain, but there's a lot of work in mobilizing the people and making sure that you also create partnerships with various NGOs and various organizations and various communities who are engaged in the similar struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Sine. I also want to highlight Minnie Vagawan from our team at CI, but also from the Philippines highlighted, the importance of solidarity with communities, not just when things are going well, but when it's being difficult. And I think that's a really important element to echo in this process. Any other questions from our participants here that we have for our group? You can feel free to open your mic if you have a particular question, or you can share it in the chat. All right, if there's no questions, I'm gonna round this to a close. And I want to thank all of our, I want to thank the team at CI and our partners for the resource guide. And I want to thank all of our panelists today for their participation and sharing their knowledge with all of us and their experiences. We will continue to push this guide out amongst partners. And I think as we continue to push it out, there will be ongoing lessons learned. And it has to be mobilized into multiple languages. So we look forward to working with all of you and engaging all of you in this process, and we will continue to engage it with other stakeholders as we move forward. So I just want to thank you all for your participation and engagement today, and the profound discussion we've had around these issues. And I think it leaves all of us for some food for thought as we, in our daily efforts on many of these issues and the reflections we need to have. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for your time. Those of you who got up very early this morning, and those of you who have stayed up very late. Thank you again. And we will end the session a little bit today. Thanks for Ali and Patty and Minnie and others and Vince for all of their work on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.